Good afternoon, everyone. So, we're going to touch on the so-called controversial topic today, that's cancer and diabetes. And unfortunately for me, as Dr. Krishna Shishadri calls me up and says that you need to speak on cancer and diabetes. My father, who was the strength for me, was for like 20, 25 years. We've been discussing him as the ideal patient for diabetes, gets diagnosed with squamous cell carcinoma of the larynx. Anyway, at the moment he's doing fine, and I hope this audience wishes for his good health. So, what we'd like to address in this particular meeting is there is any meaningful association between diabetes and cancer incidence or prognosis? What are the risk factors that are common to both cancer and diabetes, which could be a possible link? What are the possible biological links between diabetes and cancer, and what about the therapies for diabetes and cancer? So if you see the lifetime risk in a male, the diabetes epidemic is quite undiagnosed. In male it's 1/2 and female it's 1/3. And also most of the patients with cancer will end up having diabetes. But if you take the incidence in an individual person, diabetes and cancer, it occurs more commonly than what would be expected by chance, even though they are very common illnesses. So if you see in people with diabetes, the incidence of certain cancers are definitely more, especially those of the liver and those of the pancreas and endometrium in women. The risk of these carcinomas are definitely more as compared to the general population. There are some tumors which are a little bit lesser in people with diabetes, especially the prostatic CA. So in a general statement, we can say that why pancreas carcinoma and liver adenocarcinoma are so common in patients with diabetes, because these are the tissues which have maximum exposure to insulin. And why prostate seems to be lesser is probably because androgen deficiency is associated with diabetes. These are just plausible reasons for the observations that have been made thus far. Diabetes also affects cancer mortality directly. Those people who have cancer and also have diabetes along with that, they are more likely to suffer than those who do not have, and this is especially true for CA breast, where it has been studied extensively. So what are the risk factors that are both common to cancer and both common to diabetes as well? So there are certain non-modifiable risk factors. So age. The older you are, the more the chance for being a diabetic. And the older you are, the more the chance for developing tumors. 78% of all the newly diagnosed tumors are actually occurring 55 years or older. And the prevalence of diabetes is also increasing as you grow older and older. So possibly this could be a reason why both of them are occurring together. Gender. Of course, if you remove the cancer of endometrium and cancer of breast, you'll see most of the cancers are more common in men than in women. So is diabetes. Diabetes is a little more common in men than in women. This is a very loose association. This cannot be considered as a tight association. Race. If you take the Caucasians and you compare them with the blacks, Hispanics and Indians, we'll say that the blacks, Hispanics and Indians are more likely to have both diabetes as well as cancer. Again, this is a very loose association. This is a very tight association. Overweight, obesity and weight gain. The fatter you are, the more obese you are, and the more abdominal obesity that you have, the more likely to develop diabetes. Similarly, the more weight that you have and the more overweight that you are more likely to develop cancers of the colon, rectum, endometrium, pancreas, esophagus, kidney and gallbladder. So this is a very tight association. So overweight and obesity, they both predispose to diabetes as well as cancer. And what is definitely shows that if you lose weight, especially in the diabetes prevention trials, if you lose weight, we know that we are likely to prevent diabetes. Whereas weight loss, how it helps in preventing cancers has to be studied still. We are awaiting data from the bariatric surgery group, and we want to see how the people who have undergone bariatric surgery, whether the tumor incidence in them is going down or it's same. Diet. So all this diet which most of us keep avoiding most of the times, if you're likely to consume the green leafy vegetables and fruits and whole grains, you're less likely to develop diabetes. You're less likely to develop tumors as well. So this could very well be a link between cancer and diabetes. Processed food, those who have high in fatty acids, they're more likely to cause diabetes and tumors together. Physical activity. So we well know that if you have a lot of physical activity, we are less likely to develop diabetes and diabetes complications. But physical activity has also been directly related to tumorigenesis and mortality in tumors. So it's not only that if you are physically active, you are less likely to have certain tumors, but if you already have a tumor and you do physical activity, you are actually reducing the mortality in many tumors, and this has been proven in many oncology studies. Tobacco smoking may directly predispose a person to develop diabetes, but it predisposes more strongly for a person to develop tumors. So is alcohol. So moderate alcohol consumption is supposed to be good for people with diabetes, but heavy alcohol consumption is a risk factor for developing type 2 diabetes. So it is for developing the well-known cancers that are associated with alcohol, that is oral cavity, pharynx, larynx, liver. Okay, so now we have up to now discussed all the loose possible associations between between diabetes and cancer. But are there any biological links between diabetes and cancer risk? That's what we need to discuss. If you talk about tumorigenesis, it has 3 steps. One is initiation of a tumor, that is irreversible first step towards cancer. Promotion, that is growth of the tumor cells, and progression of the cancer. Where diabetes maximum effects will be at the second step, that is promotion of tumorigenesis, and this could be because of hyperinsulinemia, hyperglycemia, and chronic inflammation. So the next few slides we will be addressing a few topics from there, specific topics. Insulin receptors. If you see that in most malignant cells, insulin receptors are expressed avidly. Even if you remove the IGF-1 receptors alone also, most of the tumors will express insulin receptors more. We all know that tumor cells, they absorb glucose directly for their metabolism. Tumor cells, they absorb glucose directly for metabolism, not so much dependent on the insulin receptor. So the presence of an insulin receptor in a tumor cell could be directly responsible for tumorigenesis, not only by the uptake of glucose, but also be related to cell survival and cell apoptosis. Insulin receptor signaling pathways are also very well defined in tumor cells, especially the IRS substrate of family and the other downstream signaling pathways. And once these are activated, they may stimulate multiple cancer phenotypes, including proliferation, protection of apoptotic stimuli, and invasion and metastasis. So insulin receptor and insulin receptor signaling pathways may directly be related with increased tumorigenesis. Hyperinsulinemia itself may be a mitogenic. So hyperinsulinemia, it might, because of acting on the insulin or the IGF receptor, it may stimulate the normal cells to develop into cancer. For example, hyperglycemia, it acts through the IGF-1 receptor and stimulates the vascular smooth muscle proliferation. So we know that this directly contributes to hypertension and cardiovascular mortality, but it also contributes to the vascular invasion of tumors. IGF-1. So IGF-1, the full form of IGF-1 is insulin-like growth factor. So in patients with hyperinsulinemia, the free IGF-1 increases. That is, because obesity and diabetes are associated with hyperinsulinemia, this goes directly and acts on the liver to decrease the IGF-BP, the IGF binding protein, and increasing the free IGF-1 levels. And free IGF-1, as we know, is a pro-growth agent. It's a mitogenic, it has mitogenic effects and contributes to tumor development. Hyperinsulinemia also plays havoc with the hormones, that is sex hormones. So we now know that hyperinsulinemia is clearly related with development of polycystic ovarian syndrome. But even in tumorigenesis, if you see, hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia is actually decreasing the sex hormone binding globulin and increasing the availability of free estrogen. And free estrogen we know is clearly developed linked for the development of CA breast. Hyperglycemia is also directly related to tumorigenesis. As we all know that most of the cancer cells, they require glucose for metabolism and growth. So the more the blood glucose level, the higher the progression of tumors. Inflammatory cytokines. So in diabetes is a state where there is altered inflammatory cytokines, including in fatty acids, free fatty acids, interleukin 6, the plasminogen activator inhibitor, adiponectin, leptin, and these all play a role in tumor progression and growth. Then we come to a topic which is more of interest to the audience here, I'm sure, more than the previous few slides. Do diabetes treatments influence cancer risk or cancer prognosis? So today morning we had an almost 20-minute presentation on metformin and how it protects against developing tumors. So metformin, through its action on the AMP kinase, it reduces the growth of tumor cells and also reducing insulin levels and reducing glycemia all contribute to the effect of metformin in reducing tumorigenesis. So this is a hard evidence that people on metformin, when they are followed up for years together, they are less likely to develop tumorigenesis and cancer mortality as compared to those who are not on metformin. So this is the table which summarizes most of the studies which have compared specific tumors with use of metformin, and it's seen that in all the studies, those people who are using metformin, they are less likely for developing cancer in the first place, and those who have cancer, they are less likely to have mortality because of cancer when they are using metformin. Thiazolidinediones. Thiazolidinediones is like one of the most controversial molecules that have hit the market. For glycemic control, I'm supposed thiazolidinediones is one of the most powerful agents in bringing down the HbA1c, most powerful oral agents without causing hypoglycemia. All of us were very happy with rosiglitazone and pioglitazone, but slowly the side effects of thiazolidinediones started to emerge. Theoretically, by reducing the insulin resistance, they reduce the insulin resistance, they will also reduce the tumorigenesis, so much so that rosiglitazone was thought of as an anti-cancer molecule till early stages. There was a meta-analysis that was published with rosiglitazone, and it found that it was not a pro-cancer agent, it was not an anti-cancer agent, it was neutral for the developing the risk of cancer. However, pioglitazone got into the soup. Bladder carcinoma cases began to be reported all over the world, including India, including from Chennai. This was the largest meta-analysis that was published in 2003, and afterwards many other meta-analyses also came up and showed down that the hazard for developing bladder cancer was significantly higher in those who were using pioglitazone, and the risk of bias was less in those who were using on all these studies. The Indian status for pioglitazone at the moment has been commanded by this Drug Technical Advisory Board statement. It says that pioglitazone can still be used, but with a red box warning. It should be written on the packet of pioglitazone. The primary healthcare provider and the diabetologist, endocrinologist should be aware of pioglitazone and its possible risks. And those people who are at higher risk for developing bladder carcinoma, especially the elderly males and females, and those who are smokers, should preferably not be given pioglitazone, and preferably don't use it as a first-line agent. So this is the statement that has been released by the Drugs Technical Advisory Board regarding pioglitazone. Sulfonylureas, although they have been used now for almost 1 century, we are unable to find out whether they promote tumorigenesis or not. All the studies that have shown say that sulfonylureas have neither a tumorigenic effect nor that they confer tumor protection, but it's very difficult to continue a long-term study using only sulfonylureas treatment because we will be adding insulin and other treatments as we go ahead. Incretin-based therapies, as we know, liraglutide in preclinical studies, they increase the risk of medullary thyroid carcinoma in rats. And even in human models, they are supposed to increase the pancreatic duct hyperplasia and increase the risk of pancreatic carcinoma, not only with the GLP-1 analogs, but also with DPP-4 inhibitors. However, the direct associations between pancreatic carcinoma or medullary thyroid carcinoma has not been proven in any study as yet in human beings. Insulin. So these are the 4 studies which really created a lot of ruckus with insulin and tumorigenesis, especially the one in Germany where even Lantus was withdrawn after the study came in. So insulin glargine, it has a disparate impact on cancer risk, possibly because it has a more selective binding, not selective binding, it has a more binding towards IGF-1 receptors as compared to the other insulin molecules. But the potential strengths and weakness of all the studies have been debated and detailed, and most of the people now believe that we still require larger and larger databases to really prove whether glargine is associated with tumorigenesis or no. Insulin, how they may be associated with tumors, they may be having direct actions or indirect actions. Direct actions could be because of interaction of the administered ligands, insulins, with the cancer cells, or interaction of the signaling molecules who affect the tumorigenesis. The Origin trial, which was now recently released, showed that when even glargine was used from right in the early stages, at least in this trial, did not increase the risk of cancer. That means the risk of cancer was same in those people who used glargine as compared to those who used a comparator molecule. So this is the summary of medications of diabetes and the cancer risk. So if you see, metformin in fact has possible protective benefits on cancer outcomes, and there is no discernible cancer risk. So metformin is safe as far as cancer development in the long term is concerned. Rosiglitazone, there is no evidence of cancer risk, but it has multiple other problems. Pioglitazone, if you use in cumulative chronic high doses, possible risk of bladder cancer is there. It's still debatable. The SGLT2 inhibitors, which we thought will pass into the urine and cause a chronic exposure of high blood glucose to the bladder, still there is no evidence of cancer risk with the SGLT2 inhibitors. The GLP-1 agonists, not in human beings. No evidence of MTC or pancreatic cancer in human beings. No evidence of MTC or pancreatic in human beings with the DP4 inhibitors as well. Insulin, the concern of cancer risk at very high doses may be still there. This is a statement that has been released by the AAC body, which had convened together earlier this year. Still the unanswered questions, they lie. Okay, we don't know how diabetes affects the risk and progression of cancer, especially at specific sites, because we cannot have randomized controlled trials. And many trials are going to be confounded by the numerous crossovers. We cannot keep a person only on metformin for a long time, or only on sulfonylurea for a long time, or only on insulin, because they'll keep on changing from one therapy to another. And just as it is with calcium and cardiovascular disease, I was a part of a meeting in IOF, that is International Osteoporosis Federation. This is a similar problem. There one person raised the question to see whether calcium can be used in one arm and calcium should not be used in one arm, and we should study the cardiovascular outcome. Same thing with drugs for diabetes. For example, insulin, how we cannot call a patient and say that we are going to randomize you either to insulin this or insulin that and find out whether you're going to or no. The patient is definitely going to run away from you. So the practicality for developing randomized controlled studies for tumorigenesis and insulin administration or any other treatment lies there, and we will not probably be able to get an answer in the near future. So multiple well-conducted and appropriately designed prospective observational studies may be needed rather than case-controlled studies. So I'd like to conclude by saying that cancer, it occurs in patients with diabetes more commonly than what would be expected by chance. And there are many common risk factors for both illnesses. Some of them are loose risk factors, some of them are very tight risk factors. Hyperglycemia contributes directly to tumor progression. Hyperinsulinemia contributes to tumor progression. And the inflammatory markers which go haywire in diabetes also contributes to tumor progression. The effects of treatment of hyperglycemia on cancer risks are still very controversial. We still require data for that to give a concluding remark on this particular aspect. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, sir. Now I request all the speakers to come to the podium, and we'll have 15 minutes question and answer session. And I invite questions from the audience.
So to set the ball rolling, can I start it to Dr. Sridhar? Is sleep associated with satiety?
Again, I think you have all these, that's what the PLO's article has said, that if people sleep less, they have less amount of leptin and increased amount of ghrelin, which tend to increase the amount of food that is taken. But then you can't look at it only in a single way. It's possible that there is a hormonal basis for increased food intake in those who sleep less.
You said anybody take questions?
Dr. Venkatraman.
Yes, Dr.
Can I?
Venkatraman. Yeah, I can see you now.
Yeah, this is to Santosh. Santosh, it was an excellent oration as usual. Now, I thought for the benefit of the audience, I'll just start some fundamental issues. Let's see whether we have some clarification. When we talk about tumorigenesis, there are two aspects. One is mitogenesis, the other is oncogenesis. So it is not very difficult to conceive a molecule like insulin or anything that promotes growth can provide a facilitative role for a malignancy. So playing a passive permissible role in the setting of hyperinsulinemia in obesity or diabetes associated with cancer is not difficult to comprehend. But the issue is oncogenesis, which means one particular cell line, maybe because of a mutation, abnormally proliferates, and in this scenario, the hyperinsulinemia can play a facilitated role, right? Can we hypothesize that probably the hyperglycemia is responsible for some mutation so that the malignancy is initiated by the hyperglycemia and being maintained or sustained by the hyperinsulinemia? I'm just loud thinking because there is a missing link. Just because it has got the facilitated role for producing mitosis, that is cell division, doesn't mean that the causative association with initiation of malignancy can be accepted. What are your views?
So the controversies remain with diabetes, with tumor initiation. We don't know whether people with diabetes, they develop certain mutations which predispose them to develop a new tumor. So all the studies that have been studied thus far are not for the initiation of tumor, but for the progression of tumor growth and metastasis is more likely to develop in people with diabetes, and cancer becomes apparently more evident in people with diabetes. Yes, but now there are certain studies and there are certain schools of thought which are now thinking that hyperglycemia or even hyperinsulinemia may play a role in tumor initiation, because we know that insulin is mitogenic, it grows, it helps in growth of smooth muscle cells. So can it help in developing a malignant change or a genetic change is still debatable, and still there are some schools of thoughts and studies that are examining that line of thought. Till now we don't have any concrete evidence that it plays a role in origin of tumors, but we have some loose evidence that it may help in the growth of tumors and progression of tumors.
Yes, sir.
So
Please.
Dr. Sridhar, thanks for an excellent talk, and I want you to look at the public health, comment on the public health implications of sleep. One is, the knowledge that sleep probably promotes inflammation and causes diabetes. Is it time to stop working for America? Is it time to create or at least create studies that look at this with our BPO workers? Our youngest and most productive people are at risk for diabetes, also because of lack of sleep. Shift workers. Do you think it's time to take a public health look at the need for sleep? About turning off the television at 9 o'clock at night? Should you say no more TV? There are countries where obesity is there, where television, especially childhood obesity, television is not played between 4 and 6. So do you think it's time to turn off the TV at 9 o'clock? Do you think it's time to say, look, you can't work for America anymore from your house, you go have an 8 to 5 job?
Yes, in an ideal world, yes. In an ideal world, yes.
Dr. Sridhar,
What Dr. Sridhar has also pointed out very nice is the lack of distraction in the night time. If you consider ourselves as doctors, we are running around from the morning to the evening, but in the night time we are putting our legs on the couch, watching TV and munching a lot of things in the night time. It always, the snacks start at 10 o'clock onwards only. So I think the lack of distraction and the availability of junk food definitely contributes to the late night sleepers developing diabetes and other metabolic problems.
No, I think the practical aspect is shift work. They say that you need at least 3 months of work for the body to really get used to it. And then they say that some people, they are more used to the shift work. That is, even though they work for years, they are able to adjust to that. Unless we can pick those up, it's quite difficult. Because often you find that every third day they have a shift. One day they work from 8 to 6 o'clock, then 6 to 12. Third day is 12 to 8 o'clock in the morning.
Sir, I'm going to prod you a little more because you have such expertise on sleep and it's been your life's work. Nobody has really found out whether we need sleep. That's something that there's no data to support. Evolutionary is sleep required, but if you look at from nurture, this sleep, even being awake till 9 or 10 o'clock is only a phenomenon of 100 years. There was no light, so people went ate before sunset and went to sleep after that. And probably we have not given as much importance to sleep as we have given to our diets itself. How much do you think? I mean, if you were to say in a score of 1 to 10, how much do you think it's not just the food but sleep actually contributing to some of our lifestyle, the lifestyle disease we sleep? And do you think it's time for doctors to actually talk to patients about look, you're a diabetic. You reviewed an article that we submitted that showed that patients with altered sleep had higher A1Cs. Do you think it's time for doctors to talk to patients that look, your sleep time is as important?
That's at least you ask the patients, how do you sleep? You start off like looking at the foot or asking, do you smoke? So you can have one more question, how is your sleep? How do you sleep? So you'll be quite surprised to find that so much of problems will be there about sleep. And what you're saying, it's quite difficult to implement, but then we have to really look at it. There's no doubt about it. And short sleepers, long sleepers, I was quite surprised to find that there were genes which make people quite happy with 6 hours of sleep. So maybe there are some mutations. What those mutations are, maybe down the line we'll be able to know. But statistically, the diabetes care position statement meta-analysis has showed that 7 to 8 hours is ideal if you have a choice.
Can I also supplement and ask you, what about a power nap in the afternoon or a siesta? Which is better? A siesta is nice, but do you think a power nap is good? Is it sufficient? Should diabetics have a power nap?
No, in fact, I didn't really look at that. And the other thing is about what is the evolutionary role of sleep. Because it was only 20 minutes, I didn't mention it. There's one publication in PLOS where they have said that sleep has an evolutionary role and then it does it. We had, one of my students' PhD work, he worked on the built environment in which he had asked about the sleep in the afternoon. And what he found was those who were sleeping in the afternoon, they were slimmer than those who did not. Whether it makes a difference or not, I don't know, but that's an observation.
Dr. Sridhar, there have been some publications which states that even in non-diabetic patients, if sleep deprivation causes higher HbA1c. And you said the recommendations, sleep between 7 to 8 hours. Suppose what if somebody sleeps more?
No, again, what I'm saying, that is statistics. They have taken 100,000 people, looked at their sleep hours, and they found, just like saying when we were doing our MD, we said that 140 is the cutoff for fasting plasma glucose. It came down to 126, 108, where it's going down. So I think we depend on evidence.
Is there a U-shaped curve? More you sleep, the more...
I think that's what I said. Those who slept less than 6 hours, they had more body weight, more incidence of diabetes. Those who slept more than 8 to 9 hours, they had more prevalence of diabetes. So 8 to 9 hours is, I don't know what we call it, that's it.
People sleep 8 hours. Clinically, we see they still feel so tired in the mornings. They feel exhausted. Other than sleep apnea syndrome. So I wonder whether just the duration of sleep or the effectiveness of sleep is important.
No, both if you can. The quality of sleep and the quantity both are important. Because you find that NRM is what really makes a difference. What they have said is, if you lose sleep, you may be refreshed by greater amount of NRM sleep rather than sleeping longer. But then NRM again, you need to have an EEG sleep lab for you to identify. But there are so many subtleties in this. So you need to have both of them. And those who can get over the sleep lag, they have more of this restful sleep.
It seems most of the studies, mostly the sleep was studied according to a questionnaire given, then scientifically, analyzed. Not sleep studies were done in many of the patients, and more it was a subjective deposition. Do you have a sleep questionnaire in your clinic, sir? You have asked the patient about diet, you ask the patient about exercise, complaints with medications.
We have a rough and ready thing. Dr. Seshadri published using a sleep questionnaire.
Yeah.
Yes, he's done that. And what they are now saying is, it depends on the patient's perception. You don't have to do an EEG to say whether the sleep is satisfactory or not. It depends on how the person perceives sleep, whether it is satisfactory or not. Even if you find that it's like operation is successful, patient is critical. If you think the duration of sleep is okay, but if the patient does not perceive it as being restful, so that could be one other aspect in the analysis of these.
One of the things that you need to worry about is in a sleep lab. If I'm sleeping in my house, I sleep on the right side of my wife, and she's on this side, and she turns to the other side, and I'm turning to this side. If he changes our position, and my sleep is disturbed. I checked into Savera a day before yesterday. I'm unable to sleep without the comfort of somebody next to me, like my wife. So, I'm not asking for another person, but the important thing is that in things like sleep and things like neuropathy, I think it's important to understand that what you find in a physiologic recording may not necessarily reflect the reality of subjectivity. While we decry subjectivity, these are probably instances where subjectivity is more important than the measurement we make. And in fact, in our work, we found that patients are very good at saying how good or how well their sleep is. And ultimately, I guess that's what matters.
So can we move to the next topic?
Because people have started sleeping. Sir, regarding the, excuse me.
Can we have a last question?
Last brief.
Probably we can take it as a comment also. It has been found that the stress causes hyperglycemia, increased HbA1c levels, and by listening to the lecture, we understand that optimum amount of sleep reduces the HbA1c levels. Hypothetically, can we say that optimum sleep can reduce the HbA1c levels? One, in a diabetic patient with sleep disturbances, it has been observed, if you give some drugs like alprazolam, by giving this, can we bring down the HbA1c levels? Is there any data available?
I'm not aware of that.
Regarding the incretins and safety profile, sir, you talked about the lesser incidence of hypoglycemia. This lesser incidence of hypoglycemia, as a monotherapy, we take it. But most of the time they are combined with sulfonylureas, insulin, where definitely the incidence of hypoglycemia is increased. So would you request all the attending doctors to take care while combining with other agents? And
definitely, see, monotherapy alone, the incidence of hypoglycemia is less. With gliptin or incretin based treatments, incidence is practically negligible. But if you combine with other sulfonylurea, especially powerful sulfonylurea, which we are using here as glibenclamide and all, the incidence of hypoglycemia is not that uncommon. So if you go for metformin or beta cell sparing treatment, like say metformin, gliptin-based treatment, the incidence is very less. If you go for higher treatment, secretagogues, incidence you should anticipate a little more.
Just one question regarding gliptins. Gliptin, you said low level of hypoglycemia. Is it because they are much less effective compared to sulfonylureas in getting the blood glucose? Not as effective as...
No, you can't say like that, sir. See, basically, effectiveness ways, glycosylated hemoglobin reduction to a tune of 1.5% and sulfonylurea or secretagogues 2%. No, I don't think it's because of that.
Sir, regarding the cardiovascular safety, is it premature, too early, less robust data?
No, so we have lot of data now. I think we should wait little more time because there ample, pretty good number of data is coming up. Mostly we'll get a data in the year 2014.
Yeah. We have a recent paper in New England Journal last week where saxagliptin and alogliptin were found to produce more heart failure in patients.
We'll wait for a little more time because we have to get a large randomized trial again. We'll get it within next year.
The incretins are given at a very high dosage. So, do you think that is going to, compared to the DPP-4, the incretin when you give, the amount of incretin that the body faces is very high. Do you think it can have a negative physiological effect? Though it's been as of such proved that it doesn't. But there is still data yet to be available.
Incretin mimetics versus DLP-4. So there is no, as far as I know, sir, there is no data like that.
Dr. Sridhar, I have a peculiar question. Husband is having a sleep apnea, obstructive sleep apnea. Wife is having a disturbed sleep because of sleep apnea for husband. How far the chances of developing a diabetes in a woman of the wife?
So in these days of finding it difficult to get research questions, if some of us can look at this, it's quite interesting.
No, she can get a divorce easily. Sir, regarding the question of cancer and diabetes, isn't the missing link very simple? Is it just the insulin resistance?
If that was the only answer, then metformin would have been the final panacea for all treatments of tumors. Definitely, there is a lot of things surrounding insulin resistance which might be contributing to the same thing. So I think metformin, insulin resistance is the stronghold. I mean, it is one of the most important points here, which is the link. But only giving metformin or agent which reduces this insulin resistance like like pioglitazone should have actually brought down the tumor incidence drastically in that case.
Isn't it diabetic people are screened for various illnesses, cardiovascular illnesses, and also for cancer? Is it does it cause more incidence of or more diagnosis of diabetes, especially when they say using metformin, less people die of colorectal cancer? There's been saying that these people have more GI side effects. They are screened for GI malignancies very early, and if they have it, they are treated well sufficiently, so the mortality rate comes down. Is it more screening in a diabetic patient leads to more incidence of detection of cancer?
Possibly that is a definite answer to what he says, because a diabetic patient is a more health conscious person. He goes to the doctor more often, and there is more screening and more other variants which can be there. This one of the reasons. Let's put it. One of the many links that are found between diabetes and tumorigenesis.
Any more questions from the audience?
I add a few more things. I can't quote the study where they have said they looked at people who had cancer, and they found that the prevalence of diabetes was more. So it's not that people are screened more for cancer. And maybe there's truth in what you said, because Professor M. Viswanathan, he came when we were doing our MD, and he said it's always better to have a touch of diabetes because it doesn't really harm you, and then the doctor will take care of you and try to identify other disorders which are there. And one query for Dr. Santosh. I think I was reviewing cancer and diabetes a couple of years back. What they said was diabetes, the complications of diabetes, you have to include cancer. And then you'll have to search for cancer like you look for retinopathy or nephropathy. And they also said that you don't look at the kind of drug you use for the risk of getting cancer. Suppose a person has cancer, fair enough. You'll be careful with some of these drugs. So you should not be looking at the risk of cancer when you do that. This was about 2-3 years back. I wondered whether you found something else in these 3 years.
No, as such, no recommendation now says that we should screen more actively for cancer in patients with diabetes. But logically speaking, I think, yes, now we should be more careful with tumorigenesis and developing tumors in patients with cancer. And we should be a little bit more cautious with people with diabetes because they may have a slightly more risk of developing cancer as regard to the general population. And from today morning, I think we have discussed vitamin D and we have discussed vitamin B12 in the treatment of diabetes. We have also discussed alprazolam for the treatment of diabetes. I think what Dr. Sridhar says is very important here. A good lifestyle modification which includes sleep and exercise to reduce the insulin resistance will go miles in preventing diabetes complications rather than anything else.
Sir, parallel to your words, you are telling about the inflammatory markers. Is there anything, any test for the detection of the inflammatory marker or biochemical markers so that we can take some
no recommendation or no data has proven that if you have this inflammatory marker higher, you need to screen more for cancers. These are only studies have shown plausible links between inflammatory markers that are found more in diabetes and tumorigenesis. I think in future, maybe another 4-5 years, I think we should develop some link which will help us in telling that this person might be more prone for developing tumors rather than the other diabetic patients.
We can take some safety measures.
One practical question for Dr. Sridhar. See, this is a common thing. There's a lot of sleep deprivation and then catching up sleep. People try to make it up in the weekend. Does it really help? Does it improve insulin sensitivity?
I'm not aware of any studies studying exactly, but at least in terms of, what they say is over the weekend you at least sleep and try to get back some of what you get. What that thing could be in terms of hours, or it could be in the NREM sleep which you get it. So after acupuncture, somebody said, after learning of this, I'm not sure whether penicillin is doing the work or the injection. So whatever you do, so long as you feel better, that's fair enough.
I thank the speakers and the organizers for giving us this opportunity. Thank you, sir.